What if events had unfolded differently in the MCU timeline? What if another had entered in Avengers Endgame, causing havoc and chaos everywhere? What if DreamWorks Shrek was in Avengers Endgame? How would Shrek change the timeline of the MCU? By inserting this character and manipulating events of the multiverse, what do you think would happen if one character was present during Thanos' reign as the Mad Titan? Now, we're going to be looking at part 2. If you haven't seen What If Shrek Was in Avengers Infinity War, I would highly recommend that you check that out, as it's going to be kind of like a part 2 rather than a different video. So we've seen Shrek with the Infinity Gauntlet and how Rumpelstiltskin actually made Shrek get the Infinity Stones from the contract. So he kind of manipulated the contract, and now we have an unleashed Shrek. But I do want to say, make sure to check out the Instagram, and do make sure to also look at the Patreon for all the latest behind the scenes content. It's starting at just $1 a month. But that being said, my fellow watchers of the multiverse, let's get back into this insane Marvel's What If crossover fanfiction. After Shrek had snapped his fingers, the drastic effects had begun. People began to fade away, and in their place, cartoon characters from Shrek's universe replaced them. The two worlds had been merged, and this was creating a catastrophic effect. The cartoons had immediately begun the realistic transformation in the texture of the new universe they were brought into. It was a matter of an hour before they became fully bestial, conjuring with the fact that some of their friends, family, had gone missing without a trace. Humans of Earth 616 had to survive in this new world that had turned them into part of the food chain. In order to survive, one had to combat a bestial character almost every day due to their number. The Avengers, who had not been wiped out by the event, provided assistance in combating these creatures, although their morale was weakened because of their losses that they had suffered after the snap. They were desperate for any means to bring back the lost population. In their desperation, they were able to trace the powerful burst of the stones, which had been used again. After investigating, they found the destroyed gauntlet with broken pieces of the stone, but there was no Weir. 23 days after the snap, Tony and Nebula were the only two people left who had gone to the planet of Titan. Due to their fierce battle, the ship which they came in had been destroyed, and they had been stuck in deep space. The rest of the parties had vanished with the snap of Shrek's fingers. They had made peace with the fact that they may never return to Earth. Captain Marvel, who had initially been called by Nick Fury, saw the stranded ship while soaring through space and investigated to know if there was any sign of life. On seeing that Tony and Nebula were there, she rescued them by taking the ship back to Earth, where they met up with the remaining Avengers: Natasha Romanoff, Steve Rogers, Sam Rhodes, and Rocket Raccoon, who were confirmed what indeed had happened. Tony told them that they had successfully captured Thanos, who was dead on board the ship. The Avengers were confused. They wondered how the plan still worked. If Thanos was captured, Tony began to narrate how they had successfully removed the gauntlet from Thanos, but it was worn by an unknown creature who they had underestimated. Eventually, the creature had caused the merger of the worlds he was from and the one that they were in. Steve told the rest of the crew that he and Natasha had been able to trace the stones since it had been used again, and the impact effect around the area. But when they arrived at the location, they found the stones destroyed and no one with it. This led to them to believe that the creature was destroyed together with the stones when he tried to use it again. Scott Lang had been sucked into the quantum realm for some time, due to the fact that the two scientists who were meant to pull him out of the quantum realm had disappeared after Shrek snapped his fingers. He had been stuck there. In the quantum realm, time worked differently. To Lang, he had been in the realm for 5 hours, when in actual time on Earth, he had been there for 5 years. Due to the disciplined condition of the garage, rats had begun to inhabit there. Fortunately for Lang, one of the 3 blind rats from Shrek's universe chewed the cord, which was to be activated in order to bring Lang back to Earth. Lang was brought out of the quantum realm to see the devastating status of his surroundings, outgrown with vines and crawling with unsurreal insects. Scott stared in disbelief when he walked through the streets. The buildings were in shambles, and the day looked distorted. Some buildings looked like they had been taken directly from a storybook, intertwined with vines. As Scott walked on, he saw creatures staring at him. The inhidious of the creatures made Scott wrench. He had an unsettling feeling that they were up to no good, and that he did not have enough energy to fight them off. Scott settled for the next best thing. He began to run. The creatures chased after him, happy that they had seen their next meal. The first thought he had in his mind was to check on his daughter. He sprinted towards his house. The fear he had thought for his daughter was already happening in his gut when he reached the door and banged the door, only to see her emerge with a gun. She was grown and bigger than the last time he had seen her. She immediately opened the door for him and fired the gun at the creature that had gotten close enough to the front porch. The rest of the creatures halted in their steps and fled. His daughter told him what had happened, how the cartoon world had merged with their universe. After certain people had gone missing, she explained that they thought he was one of the people that had gone missing. They had gone as far as to name his mark on the marble structure, which had been in memory of those people who were lost. Scott told his daughter that he needed to visit the Avengers to find out their plan to restore balance. Hope was worried due to the fact that there were creatures lurking around, and they had gotten more vicious over the past few years. Scott told her not to worry. He suited himself and shrunk down to ant size and left. After enlarging to his normal size, Scott furiously tried to alert the attention of the Avengers through their intercom. Natasha noticed and was wary if it was one of the shape-shifting creatures from the other universe. She informed Steve, who told her to let him in. They captured Scott and tied him up as a means of restraint. Scott protested and defended his identity. He began to ramble about the fact that he had been stuck in the quantum realm for 5 hours. He explained to them that time worked differently in the quantum realm, and that they could harness the power of the realm to time travel. At this moment, they knew that it was Scott, as no creature would know the quantum realm. Scott suggested that they could go back in time to take the stones and use them in order to restore the remaining half of the population. Steve and Black Widow understood the plan, and it seemed workable in their eyes, but they needed to consult the experts, Tony and Banner. Steve, Natasha, and Scott, armed to the teeth, had gone to visit Tony, who had an electromagnetic fence armored in his cabin to secure him and his family. Tony noticed their presence. He asked Steve a question which they knew only Steve would know the answer to, which Steve answered. Tony let them in. Steve told Tony that they had a plan to bring back the other population that had vanished. Steve began to explain the plan about using the quantum realm as a source of time travel by building a time machine that would be able to harness its power. Tony told them that he would not assist them because it was impossible to go back in time. They tried to talk him into trying, but Tony had already made up his mind. He asked them to leave. After they had left, Pepper Potts, Tony's wife, she told him that if there was a way to bring back the people who had gone missing, that he should try. Tony listened. In his basement alone, he stumbled on a picture he had taken with Peter Parker, who had vanished with the rest of the population. This softened Stark's heart. At the eatery at 5:03 p.m., Scott and Natasha went to the next person who was smart enough to verify if the idea of time travel was workable: Bruce Banner. Banner had achieved harmony with the Hulk. He was able to maintain his Hulk form and communicate perfectly as a normal person. After Scott had told Banner his plans, Bruce noted that the plan was workable if they had built a time machine properly. He noted that changing the past would not affect their present, as it would create alternate realities. Bruce told them that he would come back to build the machine, but he would need Tony's help. They told him that Tony had refused to help them. Back at the tower, Bruce had started making plans on how to build the machine. When Tony arrived, he told Steve that he was only attempting to build the machine because he owed it to Peter. After they had built the time machine and it was tested and it was found to be working, Steve suggested that they would need the team back. After they had found out that the stones had been destroyed, the team had split because it seemed like there was no alternative way. Thor had been hiding in New Asgard, nursing his emotional wounds from the devastating defeat he had faced. Bruce and Rocket had volunteered to bring him back, although it was initially difficult, but after they had convinced Thor that there was beer on the ship, he followed them. Thor had become overweight due to his regular indulgence in beer drinking, his coping mechanics. New Asgard had survived so far due to the prowess of Valkyrie, who protected them from the creatures. Natasha, on the other hand, had gone to Tokyo to recruit Clint, who had become a vigilante. Clint became a vigilante as a means to cope with his family's loss. Someone needed to step in and hunt down the creatures that had been emerging after the other half had vanished. Natasha convinced Ronan to come back because they had found a way to bring back the other half of the population. For ease, they had divided themselves into teams who would visit different locations to get the stones. Clint and Natasha were to visit Vormir for the Soul Stone. Rocket and Thor were to visit Asgard in 2013 for the Reality Stone. Steve, Tony, Bruce, and Scott were to visit New York in 2012 for the Space Stone, Mind Stone, and the Time Stone. Nebula and Rhodes were to visit Morog to get the Power Stone before Peter Quill got it. They each had 2 Pym particles to make the trip, one to go and one to come back. As they climbed the time machine, they stared at each other, hoping that they would see themselves again in another few minutes. What the Avengers did not know was the effects of Shrek's snap would transcend into the past, which had become their future if they went to do it. The merged universe had latched itself onto them like a parasite and would follow them wherever they went. They would inadvertently bring doom onto the time frame they would go to if their plan failed. Clint and Natasha had gone to Vormir to retrieve the Soul Stone. On the planet, they had met Red Skull, who served as a guardian for the Soul Stone. He instructed those seeking the stone on having to get it. Red Skull informed them that in order to get the Soul Stone, one of them would have to sacrifice their life for the other to get the stone. This led to a tussle between Clint and Natasha on who would die. Clint jumped off the cliff, but Natasha attached a rope and climbed him to the concrete as she dove ahead of him. Clint caught her hand and begged her not to sacrifice herself, but she smiled and told him that everything would be alright. She pressed her hand out of Clint's vice-like grip and fell to her death. Clint was immediately transported to the location of the Soul Stone and emerged with it. Although he had the Soul Stone, he was heartbroken that he had lost a friend. Nebula and Rhodes were transported to the planet of Morog, where the Power Stone was kept. They planned on stealing it before Peter Quill had a chance to lay his hands on it. After they had entered the tomb, which the stone was kept, Nebula stopped Rhodes from putting his hand through the force field, as she noticed that it would burn his flesh. She put her hand through the force field, as it would not melt her robotic arm. After they had gotten the stone, Peter arrived, and he was easily incapacitated by the War Machine, who knocked him out. After securing the stone, they pressed the Pym particle to be taken back to the reality. Before Nebula could activate the particles, she started to short-circuit. The fact that she was in the same reality as herself in 2014 created a cyber link that created a magnetic wave that short-circuited the two parties. The 2014 Nebula, who was in the ship with her father, Thanos, had also begun to display bits of the future. This attracted the attention of her father. Thanos, who was eager to know what had happened, took Nebula to extract the information from her. Due to the cyber link between the 2014 Nebula and the future Nebula, it was easy to access the information of all Nebula had seen in the future. Though this, Thanos knew he had failed. He saw a projection of how he had been ambushed in his home planet, Titan, and the gauntlet had been stripped from him. Thanos watched, unsure of what was happening. He saw another creature that wore the gauntlet. He smiled. He knew that if the Avengers were running around in the past, that meant that somehow his plan had worked. But this dropped another thought in his mind. He realized that as long as there were still people in the world to remember what was, then they would not be able to move forward. Thanos set 2014 Nebula to capture her future self, but before she arrived, she was gone. Together with Rocket, had traveled to Asgard in 2013 in order to recover the Reality Stone by extracting it from Jane Foster. Thor also used the opportunity to test his worthiness, recalling Mjolnir, which came to him. This renewed his sense of worthiness, as only worthy people could lift his hammer. Back in 2014, Steve, Scott, and Tony traveled back in order to obtain the Mind Stone, the Space Stone, and the Time Stone, which were all in the same place. In the Stark Tower, Steve was able to retrieve the Mind Stone by convincing a group of Hydra agents who were transporting the Mind Stone to a secure location. He was able to use this by repeating their chant. Tony and Scott were able to steal the Space Stone from 2012. Tony asked Scott to shrink down and enter his younger self's metal heart, to cause him to have a cardiac arrest. The incapacitation of 2012 Tony presented an opportunity for the duo to steal the Space Stone. As Tony and Scott walked out of the tower, 2012 Hulk, who had been asked to take the stairs, due to his weight, bursted through the walls and knocked Tony down. This caused the briefcase containing the Space Stone to cascade towards 2012 Loki, who had been captured. Loki picked up the Space Stone and disappeared with it. The disappearance of Loki was related to the 2012 Steve Rogers by his team. 2012 Steve had spotted his future self and thought that it was Loki, the shapeshifter. After a brief battle, and 2012 Steve was incapacitated, the future Avengers discussed how they would be getting the Space Stone that Loki had vanished within. Steve noted that they had one Pym particle left. Tony suggested that they would go back to 1970, where the older version of the Space Stone was kept, alongside the mass production of Pym particles. Scott took the Mind Stone to the present. As Steve and Tony were about to leave, the Earth began to rumble and separate. They stared as vines erupted from the ground and intertwined itself around the buildings. Steve asked Tony how it was possible that the merger was affecting the past. Tony signed in embarrassment, as he had forgotten about the effect of time travel. He explained to Steve that the effect had occurred in their time and had latched itself to them and had transcended the timeline when they time traveled. Steve was confused. Tony further explained that what had happened in their timeline would start to occur in this and other timelines, unless they stopped it from the beginning. Steve told Tony that they needed to leave urgently in order to stop the effect from spreading across the universes. The merging worlds in 2012 had given the opportunity for Shrek to come back. The second snap he had made in a desperate attempt to convene the contract with Rumpelstiltskin had worked. The 2012 Shrek had no idea of what he had done, but the effect of all cartoons in the real world happened to him. Slowly, Shrek began to conform to the texture of the real world, losing his emotions and his ability to feel. Shrek was confused. His world had changed drastically. Tony sighted Shrek and informed Steve that Shrek was the one who had taken the gauntlet. Steve was torn between confronting Shrek and going back in time. Steve informed Tony that he was too dangerous to be left to roam in the past. Steve suggested that they trapped him and go back in time to get enough particles to transport all of them to their present, where they could watch him effectively. Tony noted an affirmation, raised his suited arm, and shot at Shrek. Shrek was immediately knocked down. Bruce had traveled to the Sanctum in New York, where the Ancient One resided, and was in custody of the Time Stone. After a brief misunderstanding, Bruce was able to convince the Ancient One to give him the Time Stone, after he told her that Strange had willingly gave up the Time Stone to Thanos. As they were speaking, the earth rumbled and began to split. The Ancient One understood what was happening and quickly gave the stone to Bruce, telling him that the fate of their timeline was in their hands. It was 1970 and Tony and Steve arrived at the headquarters, and they moved with urgency, knowing what was about to happen and what was at stake. Tony explained to Steve where the Pym particles were and how he would get there. Tony, on the other hand, was to obtain the older version of the Space Stone. Steve disarmed a guard and used the key card to access the location of the Pym particles. Tony had successfully obtained the Space Stone when he bumped into his father, Howard Stark, who felt an instant connection to him. After a brief conversation with his father, Tony hugged him and went to meet up with Steve. They traveled back to 2012 to capture Shrek, who was still passed out. The state of 2012 New York had gotten worse. More creatures had emerged, and buildings had crashed down. The streets were destroyed as people ran for safety. Tony quickly attached the Pym particle to Shrek and activated it. The Avengers had arrived at the tower when they discovered that Natasha had died while trying to get the Soul Stone. They also noticed that Nebula was missing. The pain they felt was enormous, but they knew the time for that would come. They fixed the stones into the gauntlet that had been prepared by Stark. Bruce opted to use the stones since he could withstand the gamma radiation from the Infinity Stones. Shrek, who had passed out, woke up. He was behind the Avengers, hence they could not see him. Shrek had become fully bestial and was raving mad. Shrek snuck up on Steve, who, out of impulse, turned and punched him hard. Shrek soared through the air and landed on the control panel of the time machine. This opened a portal which gave access to 2014 Thanos to come through. Bruce realized that time was running out. He wore the gauntlet and snapped his fingers to bring back the lost population and separate the worlds. Thanos fired at the tower to destroy the Avengers. Slowly, the worlds which had merged begun to separate, and the creatures began to vanish. The attack on the tower had destroyed the whole building, crashing down on the Avengers. The other Avengers, who were buried underneath the debris, were rescued by Lang, who had enlarged his size so that he was way bigger than the debris and strong enough to lift them out of it. Thanos had called forth his army in order to ensure that they had captured the Infinity Gauntlet. Meanwhile, Steve and Thor, who had escaped the crashing debris, had been altering and beating Thanos, but they were no match for the Mad Titan. He had incapacitated Thor with his axe before he was saved by Steve, who was wielding Mjolnir. After his brief moment of success, Steve was beaten by Thanos, and his vibranium shield was broken. Resilient and determined to continue fighting, Steve stood against Thanos, but the effect of the snap began to materialize. The worlds had separated, and the missing Avengers appeared through a portal created by Doctor Strange. Captain Marvel arrived from space in the heat of the battle and tore through Thanos' ship, and destroyed it. Wanda, who had been angered at the fact that Thanos had killed Vision, went all out to destroy him with her chaos magic before he ordered his men to release missiles on their troops. The Avengers had a plan. The plan was to take the Infinity Stones into the quantum realm, where only Scott could have access freely, before they destroyed Thanos. Thanos and his troops were determined to have the gauntlet. They eventually took possession of the gauntlet after knocking out Captain Marvel, who had taken it for security. With one of the stones, Tony ran towards Thanos, but was knocked down by him. Thanos told them that he was inevitable, and snapped. He realized after nothing had happened that Tony had stolen the stones from the gauntlet. Tony smiled and snapped his fingers, vanquishing Thanos. And that is going to be what if Shrek was in Avengers Endgame. This is going to be a very chaotic storyline, but does it really end here for Shrek? We'll have to see in the next video. But that being said, I hope you enjoyed this Marvel's What If crossover with DreamWorks Shrek. It's a very, very interesting one. I'm very shocked. I'm very shocked that I did not laugh throughout, writing this, and also just recording this entire thing was very funny, and I cannot thank you enough for the support on the previous video. We're going to be doing a ton of content on this channel that, we haven't really done before. I'm going to be doing a lot more. I want to get into different franchises and, do those key events as well. So, the opportunities are there, and I'm going to be doing a lot of behind the scenes content on Patreon, so you're going to be able to see what I'm working on, and it's starting at just $1 a month. So I do want to say thank you so much for tuning in to today's video, and if you guys do enjoy, do make sure to subscribe, like, share, and turn those notifications on so you and your friends are up to date with the latest content. But that being said, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care, and peace out.